I cannot wait. So I don't do this anymore. So my thought is if we get Hebrews and James done, and then I shift gears and we start talking about eschatology. So I need about 5 classes to do eschatology, which will be helpful, I think. But when we get to eschatology, like First and Second Thessalonians, what missionary journey did Paul write that on?
Thessalonians, that was the last one, wasn't it?
No. Like, so on your final, you need to know these things. This is where points are lost.
Sure.
But it's all right. You can be right and wrong now. Just don't be wrong later. Yeah. So what did he write on his first missionary journey? He wrote 1 book, right?
One. Or is it the thing?
Galatians.
Galatians. Well done. Second missionary journey, he writes 2 books.
Colossians.
No.
Romans.
No. Oh. Oh.
We're gonna go through them all.
We're gonna go back through Acts today. That's what we're gonna do. First and Second Thessalonians, right? So Paul is ministering in Macedonia, and he is facing persecution. Has to leave this community of Christians before he is done with his theology. And he'll equip the churches there, and he doesn't really have the time to equip them on eschatology, and so he has to write these letters, First and Second Thessalonians. First and Second Peter is written to a Jewish society, primarily with Gentiles also in mind. But it seems, I can't quite figure it out. It seems to lean more Jewish, which is interesting. But there is definitely a bent also for a Gentile audience in his message as well. But in his address, he's tackling, in at least the second letter, issues of eschatology. And when I say eschatology, I'm assuming you know what that means. Eschatology is a discussion around the end times. Like what's to come next, right? And so when we come to eschatology, I want to make sure we give adequate time to that. And when we go to that conversation, while we may not handle in depth First and 2 Thessalonians and like Peter, let's spend just this class next Tuesday, I think, next week, finishing up these other ones, and then we'll get into our eschatology. And so that's really a fun portion of the course. I think it's helpful for a lot of people. And that way, at the end, we can throw away our left behind books. No, don't do that. They're entertaining. You'll be okay?
Yeah.
You don't want to burn it? Have you guys read the Left Behinds?
I've watched the
What?
movies.
Left Behinds, or is that just my generation?
I watched the movies.
I watched the movies.
They have books.
What is it about?
It's about
okay,
like
so this is
the
my
end times
generation.
start happening and like all of the like half of the world.
Tim LaHaye writing about
Oh, is it a series?
yeah,
Is
like
it like
what it
kind
would be like to be an unbeliever and have the world, the Christians be raptured, right? And so
Oh.
it's this.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's interesting, entertaining, I don't know, but it's shaped a lot of eschatology for people. So, and so then we have to kind of help balance this. So my generation was big. Guess it's not anymore. We don't read anymore.
You got that?
That's not true. So what I want to do today is we want to spend some time looking into the book of Hebrews. When we get to the book of Hebrews, we were going to do. You were going to have a paper. Just to say this again, you're not doing the paper on Hebrews. I'm giving you full credit so that you do really well on your Tuesday paper. Right? That's essentially your midterm. So
Philippians.
on the book of Colossians.
Colossians.
No, Philippians. You're right.
That was embarrassing.
That was for you. That was for you. I know, it is for Philippians. And so you should be already working on that now. And if you're not, you will be this weekend for sure. But when we come to the book of Hebrews, some things that you were going to write a paper on. one of the reasons why historically in the past I've had students write a paper on Hebrews is because we don't know who the author is. And we go all the way back into the beginning of this course. Like, what were the rules or at least the things that were necessary for the church to recognize that the scriptures were inspired and needed to be a part of the canon? Do you remember what the church, like, I know this is a long time ago, feels like a long time ago, but what did the church look towards to see the letter was apostolically authentic and inspired?
Wasn't like authorship and credentials?
Yeah, authorship. So we have now here a letter that has no authorship, right? So when Luke wrote his gospel, he wrote, hey, Theophilus, I'm going to give you an account of all the things that you don't really account. We have no doubt that it's Luke who's writing these things. When Paul writes to Galatians, Ephesians, Romans, Colossians, and you go on for 2 Thessalonians, hey, Paul, it is I who writes this letter to you. James, John, like, so all these other letters, we have a name. When we get to the book of Hebrews, it starts off, Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1, God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers in many portions and in many ways, we don't even have any introduction on who's writing this text. And when you go to the end of it, go to chapter 13. In its conclusion, grace be to you all. And it was left with no authorship being described. So how in the world did Hebrews make it in the scriptures? Is this a problem?
There should be, yeah. Do they try to base it off like how he articulates and how he writes to put it as somebody that was either Paul or close to Paul?
Yeah. So if we don't have this is a perfect building block for the critic, right? So you have a Bible, you have a letter in your account that doesn't have any authorship. Like,
This doesn't make sense.
and so the critic loves like these type of these problems, right? We do know, was Mark an apostle? Was James an apostle? The brother of Christ? No. So how did they get their books in the Bible?
They were tight. They were homies.
They were homies, yeah. So in one way, they were closely associated with the apostles and had given apostolic authority, governance. They recognized, the apostles recognized these as inspired towards and given towards the church. Right? So they weren't operating like Joseph Smith in a barn, looking at two golden tablets with his own authority, his own personal evaluation. They're not like them. They are under the apostolic authority, and the apostolic authority says this is for the church. Right? So James is like this, and Mark is heavily influenced by Peter. Peter might even have been telling Mark, write this. James, in similar regards, is in Jerusalem as well with the apostolics, with the leaders. Hebrews still leaves us like, what in the world? Like, who is the author of this? So the problem we find is trying to figure out who it is. And so throughout the centuries, early church, here's the early church history, nobody has a problem with the letter of Hebrews. Everybody thinks it's supposed to be the Bible. That's interesting, but who wrote it? So there's never like a question like of its authenticity. It's just always about like, yeah, it's in there. And so in a Western mind, we're like, well, who wrote it? Right? So let me go through that. I have an opinion on who wrote it. And it's really, really early. And so since you're not writing the paper, you're going to have to put up with me going through this process of trying to figure it out and being attentive to it. When we look about authorship, you guys recognize probably this with Constable. He talks about external evidence and he talks about internal evidence. What are the two? What is he trying to express there when he talks about external evidence and internal evidence when we try to determine someone's source for the book?
External evidence is going to be like primary accounts that like would fit in like history, whereas like internal will be like
in the text,
in the writing, like with how Paul basically does all of his stuff. He's like, I, Apostle Paul, son of God, or whatever.
So external, what was said about the text outside of it, and inside of it we can see, well, the writing of Luke, his style matches in Acts. So that's internal evidence, writing styles. So when we talk about external evidence, so what did the people in the early church say externally about the letter of Hebrews? One, First Clement, this is really, really early. He loves the book and its references, but he does not help us out. So he mentions it, he frequently uses it, but he doesn't tell us, hey, so-and-so wrote it for us, inspired by God. It doesn't help us in terms, and it would be nice if he did. Would be about 90 AD. Clement of Alexander, so we're going 150, 215. He states that the author of Hebrews, and this is going to be a very popular position, was written by Paul. Apparently got this from his predecessor, Alexandria, and Bishop Pantinos. They say that correct or not. I have this theory. They just say it confidently and boldly.
I swear that's what pastors do anyway, and then you just go along.
And then you just go with it. And then everybody like, oh, that's how you say it. And really, either you make a fool of yourself or you look or appear to be really, really smart. But he had, it appears like this had come from a tradition. Origen apparently was convinced the idea found in Hebrews were very Pauline of Origen. But he struggled with the Greek style. So here you can see with Origen, we're using him as external evidence. Origen, though, as he considers the external evidence, he has a problem because he looks into the internal evidence and says the Greek style doesn't match Paul's style, right? So he comes to this conclusion. But who wrote the epistle in truth? God knows. So we're talking really, really early new church history, right? So 185, church is 200 years old at this point, not even 200 years old at this point. And everybody loves the book of Hebrews, yet there seems to be suggestion that was Paul, but Origen by 150 years later goes, who wrote it? God knows, right? It's interesting. Later Eastern Fathers, Origen's perspective set the trajectory of Eastern thought anyway on the authorship. Most people appear early in church history to assume Pauline authorship, never casting doubt on its canonicity and authenticity. Tertullian, he's during the time of Origen, Tertullian, and he ascribes it to Barnabas. And who's Barnabas?
The man.
He's a man. Yes, thank you.
The man.
The man. What man? Who is he? You remember?
He went on missionary journeys with Paul. Right?
Yeah. So a companion with Paul. Yeah, it's very possible. Barnabas could have wrote this. You remember in what chapter in Acts Ananias and Sapphira die?
4 or 5, grave, something 6 maybe.
5 died. Yeah, 5 died. Yeah. So yeah. So you're right. You said 4, 5, or 6. You're right there. You got it. Between 1 and 28. Now I'm off track. But Barnabas, he's in chapter 4 or 5. He's being influential early in the church, and the apostles actually give him a nickname, Barnabas. And so he is well liked by the apostles and seems to have a good reputation. It's very possible that Barnabas wrote it. I don't know. I have strong convictions on it. On the canon of Eusebius, this is, remember, it's like it's 3rd century. He states, it's Paul. Okay. Interesting. So if we're to look at the external evidence, there's going to be the canon of Athanasius. They say, it's Paul. 397, same thing. So if we were to take and look externally at the early church when it came to authorship of Hebrews, what you're going to find is a few names thrown out, but most people will say Paul. Or if there's rephrase that. If there's going to be like the strongest unity of discussion, it's going to be around is Paul, most likely Paul that wrote it. Okay. However, so that's our external evidence. Now let's shift over to our internal evidence. Now, internal evidence suggests this. Here's a scholarship's, some of their discussions on the matter. So Guthrie, New Testament introduction, it is almost unanimously agreed, now more postmodern society, it is almost overwhelmingly agreed that Paul did not write the letter of Hebrews. Hagner, while the writer is presumably within the Pauline circle and expects to travel with Timothy, our brother, it is certain, why do I have two I's in certain?
Certain.
Yeah, he's double certain, that it is not certain, that he is not Paul. Oyster, how would you say, is that how you'd say his name? Cloister. The tradition of Pauline authorship remains common until intensive historical investigations overturned into the 19th century. It's so fascinating. Like, the conversations that we have today that divert from early church tradition. Next class, I've asked you guys, and you will, you're going to listen to a podcast on just a discussion of women and men involved in ministry. This is a very popular conversation today, along with many other conversations. I think it's very helpful to not so quickly divert from what the church has always held. But not to suggest that we don't ever divert. But the question I have is, like, if the early church believed it was Paul for a long time, this is strange language to me. It's certainly not Paul. Something's going on, and I don't know what it is, because, I don't know, it just causes me, like, I have these little red flags in my head, and it's just like, and this doesn't sound like what the early church fathers said. And all of a sudden, 2,000 years later, we have a better perspective than they. Now, I would suggest that they had a better perspective than we did, and they were very helpful in communicating what they thought. And so we just tend to just cut them out too quickly because we are scientists. Problem with the internal evidence, it's not Pauline style. Okay, so the Greek is definitely different. Yeah, there's not clear anonymity with the other Pauline literature. Right, his use of the Greek is polished, unlike normal Pauline literature. Hebrews lacks a Pauline wandering style like Romans. In Romans, you'll have like Paul make a statement, and then he'll go like 4, before you can say, and he just keeps building upon this logical statement. Hebrews doesn't. He's got a fixed trajectory, and he is pursuing that aim throughout the whole letter. So that causes some concern, right? There's an absence of personal touch. Paul, like in Romans, one thing I find so refreshing about Romans and Philippians, all of his letters, Timothy, he calls his people out by name, right? It's like he's the pastor in front of the church, and he's like pointing his finger out. He says, "I love you." He calls them out by name. Author of Hebrews doesn't do that. It ends with grace to you, grace be to all of you. So, just grace be with you all. It is a little bit more abrupt in that regard. So difference in theological themes as well. So Paul emphasizes in his literature resurrection, redemptive work. He does not emphasize Jesus as high priest. Author of Hebrews is going to make this a big deal. Paul talks about the flesh and the spirit in one kind of aspect, but the author of Hebrews talks about it in a different application. Right? Paul, he's about justification by faith. We're saved by faith and faith alone. Author of Hebrews lacks this development, and I would also argue he actually even talks about in a way that if you don't get this right, you will lose your salvation, right? Or do not harden your hearts today or else. He gives significant warnings. The first one we see is in Hebrews chapter 2. For this reason, we must pay closer attention to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away from the truth. Author of Hebrews is trying to get a group of people to stay within Christianity and not divert out of it. So, Paul in Romans, he stresses the security of the believer. And so seems to be this conflict in the internal evidence. Okay, so this is what causes if you want to go to seminary and you want to write long, endless papers on things like this subject matter, this is what you go to seminary for. In some ways. There's other discussions as well, but you look at the external and you look at the internal and you got to figure out, okay, so then what's going on here, right? So my conclusion is the case for Pauline authorship might be fairly distilled in saying that the early church widely, but not unanimously, it's not all and not everyone, affirmed Pauline authorship. Later studies of literary and theological sort eventually persuade many of the scholarship today that Paul did not author the work. So we have this conflict. Right? So when we have a conflict like this, what do we do?
I'm understatement. I don't know.
And is it that important?
Well, I think I just want to understand. My biggest thing is who doesn't matter who wrote it, but why is it in the Bible?
Yeah.
If that's the main criteria for all the other books of the Bible, what would be the sole reason? Just because the early church fathers thought it was a good book, that's the same thing as I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. So this is where I've come to. I think there's a modern day arrogance that looks towards the past and demeans it. That's just culturally how we are as people in a postmodern society. We think we have more information. And because we have more information, that we then dictate how the rest of the world has thought. Paul has every right to use different style of Greek. And if you knew how he was raised, he had such a privileged education and upbringing. He had multiple ways of arguing for it. He has, in his letters to the church, a particular style, but that doesn't mean that that is the only style that he communicated. He was brilliant. By the time he was 12, he knew Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, and then the common language of Rome would be Koine Greek. So how many languages? He was, by the age of 12 or 14, before he moves to study under Gamaliel, he's brilliant. And then when he gets down under Gamaliel, he is going to be studying how to be a lawyer. So to suggest that Paul can only write one way, I don't buy it. And it makes me assume when I go preach, I communicate way different than I communicate in a classroom. And so I just don't think that's a very fair argument. Yeah.
Could it be the case that this is an informal letter? This isn't
Yeah, so that's a great question. So what is the author of Hebrews? What is the book of Hebrews? What is it? Because Paul writes elsewhere, it's a letter to the churches. Author of Hebrews, scholars agree, it's more like a sermon.
Yeah.
The guy is preaching. And if you want to know how the early church preached, this is how they preached. The letter of Hebrews is an excellent example of a sermon. And if that's true, that's why you don't have an introduction, and that's why you don't have a conclusion. Now, here's the other challenge. I think author of Hebrews, we didn't talk about one thing. It's about the date of Hebrews. It's relatively early, which gives it another reason why you have wide acceptance, because people must have been familiar with his authorship. But being relatively early, one strong argument, and this is now argument of silence. So we got to be careful about argument of silence as we try to figure these things out. But scholarship agree, if it was an early Christianity and Paul was the author of this sermon, it would not have been widely accepted in the church early on. Why? Do you remember what Paul did to Christians?
Yeah.
Killed them, murdered them. And so leaving out title, name, gave the church opportunity to be ministered by this sermon or by this exposition. And knowing that this was, hey, the apostles giving full authority to this. This is edifying, good for your soul, to pastors to equip and shepherd your people through. And that the other argument is that it didn't need it. It was just widely assumed who it was. And so if that's true, that's why we see a lot of the early church say it was Paul. And so I don't honestly have a hard time with the authorship issue. I know the scholar will. Early church didn't seem to have a problem with it, and it seems to have this unity with Paul. The postmodern mind says, well, the Greek's different. And I just go, man, I hope that people let me use a new word in a sermon when I learn it, right? Paul was brilliant. He could argue in different styles, and if he wanted to do something like this, he totally could have. It's within his range of getting. You had a question?
How does this fit on? I ain't kind of my question, but how would this fit on Paul's timeline of books?
Yeah. So.
Nick, would this have been early enough to where people were like, "Oh my goodness, who's this writing?" Or like he'd be scared to give his credentials?
Yeah, you remember. So right after Paul becomes a Christian, Saul becomes Paul. He goes to Damascus and he starts preaching and proclaiming in the synagogues, he's the Son of God, Jesus is the Son of God. And he begins arguing with those in Jerusalem, and those in Jerusalem don't want to go with him. And the only person that wants to associate with him is Barnabas. And it seems like that would have been a really good time for him to be somewhere in that season, in my opinion, that this might have been written or preached. Whoever preached this sermon or did this exposition he has to be brilliantly familiar with the Old Testament. Has to be. Because the way that he uses the Old Testament, he's not only familiar with it, he's a pro. Like, he's not your Sunday school teacher. He's the guy who spent hours and hours memorizing it, studying it, and because the author of Hebrews is so loaded with the Old Testament. You cannot read the author of the letter of Hebrews without the Old Testament. That's why I often say, don't read Hebrews until you take like an Old Testament course. Otherwise, it's just like whoop, right over your head. Matthew's like that too. Like, you have to have some context. The Old Testament, the author of Hebrews is just, he's clicking.
Is that like the correlation to why it's called Hebrews? Because it's including the Hebrew Bible?
Yeah, the Old Testament, yeah. And which gives us our reason for why it was, what audience it was written to. So like, audience, when we talk about moving forward to like developing why it was preached or what was the purpose of the sermon, audience was Jewish. And what you see early on in Jewish culture is before Jews became Christian, how did they worship?
Sacrifice.
So they had sacrifices. And so when they went to go do sacrifices, where would they go? The temple. And so they had this huge facility where it was absolutely beautiful, layered with gold up on the top of it. The Jews around the nation would come to worship. It was a phenomenal place. So you had sacrificial system, you had Passover, whatever you wanted to go worship, if you were a Jew, you went to Jerusalem, right? When a Jew became a Christian, where did they worship?
In the temple? No.
They weren't Jewish.
In homes.
In homes. And it was very common, yeah, so you got that. So before Christ become a Christian, Jews worshipped at the temple. As a result of Christ's sacrifice, no need for the temple anymore. No need for sacrifices. No need to go up and kill a goat, right? So now you are not going to the temple anymore. And it was very tempting for a Jew who became a Christian to watch their Jewish community go up and do all the Jewish ceremonies, go up to the big building, to have that corporate national event, for a Christian Jew to be persuaded or to be tempted to go back to Judaism. Why? Because I don't worship the temple now, I worship with people in a living room, and half of these people are Gentiles. Serious, right? If you've been in my course long enough, you know that this was a huge problem, right? And so for a Jew, what's at stake? Their national identity, their ethnic identity, their religious identity, their family, like they're worshiping in a living room with Gentiles. They're now unclean, and I can't be invited now to the Passover celebration. Right? It was very tempting to want to go back to what was comfortable. And so the author of Hebrews writes his book to persuade Jews, if you do, Jewish Christians, if you go back, you're lost.
Wow.
Okay. And so I think this is, while this hits at Jews, this hits Gentiles just as hard. Because for Gentiles to become Christians, you become unassociated with the world around us. We no longer think like the world around us. We no longer believe like the world around us. We no longer act like the world around us. We don't go do the same things on Friday nights like the world around us. And Paul's same warning would apply to Christians. You are tempted as well, Gentile Christians, are tempted to divert back to once what you were, and if you do, the wrath of God's upon you, right? There's this plea, don't do it, okay? And there's some really strong language in the author of Hebrews. And so recognizing this problem in the early church, I think it's Paul, but we'll just say maybe somebody else, but clearly had apostolic permission and blessing. As a gift to the church, you have found what is of most importance, which is Christ. The temple is just a building, and just wait. This has to be written before 70 AD, because what happens in 70 AD?
The temple is destroyed.
Temple's destroyed, right? Just wait, it'll be done, it'll be gone. And you'll be so, you'll still have Christ, right? So if you notice in my purpose statement, I tip my hand. Paul writes a letter. That's probably not right, fair or not, but I just said cautiously and humbly. Paul writes a letter to the Jewish audience in order to persuade his readers that deviating back to Judaism is reverting to an inferior religious tradition and, in fact, altogether abandoning Christ. Okay? And he warns the Christians, don't do it. You're going back to something which is inferior. So I want to show you how this works out. Let's turn to what?
I was typing really fast.
Oh, I'm sorry. Do you need that?
No, you're good.
Let me put up here, I didn't have it in here, but I'm going to turn our attention to Hebrews chapter 1. And I just want you to see, because I'm not going to spend our time to go through the entire letter of Hebrews, but I do want you guys to see what he tries to do. Because what he's going to do throughout this whole letter is he's going to take Judaism, and he's going to take Christianity, and he's going to chapter by chapter by chapter show that Jesus is way better than Judaism. Okay, so let's start with chapter 1. 1. God, oh, can you see it? 1 through 2. So God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets in many portions in many ways. Okay, stop. So if you're a Jew, you're familiar with the Old Testament, how has God historically reached the Jewish community? What ways has he done it?
Through angels.
Okay, angels.
Through like leaders. That are given
Leaders.
vision.
Through the prophets.
To the prophets. Now get specific. Like he's done it, and God has spoken in many creative ways. Burning bush. Remember? Lit a bush up on fire and then spoke through it. What else?
Freaking Moses parts.
Yeah. Yeah. Remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego?
Yeah.
Keeps them alive. Spoke through them.
Mount Sinai.
Mount Sinai. Yeah. Rainbow. So, Jews, you know, God has spoken in many portions, in many ways, to the fathers, and to the prophets, in many portions, in many ways. In these last days, however, he has spoken to us in his Son. Okay, so long ago, he spoke, God spoke, but in these days, how has he spoken? How has God spoken?
Through his son.
Through his Son. Is that better or good? Or better or worse? Better or good? No, which one's better?
Better.
Better. Christ, having the Son speak, just to clarify who the Son is, look what he does. Whom he appointed heir of all things. So, by the way, this guy, his Son, in charge of all things. Through whom also made the world. 3, verse 3. And he is the radiance of his glory, the exact representation of his nature, upholds all things by the word of his power. So yeah, Moses got to see God speak through a bush, but you got to see God speak through his Son who lets you breathe. Right? Okay. So why in the world did you want to go back to the temple? Right. So this is what he does. I call it the pancake effect. In my house, my son and I are wrestling. When I get tired and I'm done, I just put my weight on him and just and then tell he taps out. Author of Hebrews is like pancake after pancake after pancake until the Jew goes, I get it. I understand. The temple's just a piece of pile of rock. Right? What I have in Christ is far superior than what Judaism has to offer. And so, by the way, he made you. And by the way, he upholds all things. Oh, and by the way, he made purifications of sins and sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. Yes, you missed the priest system. Someone can go and atone for your sins through an animal sacrifice. But Jesus sits at the right hand of the Father. Okay, and so in the first 3 verses, you can tell what the author is trying to do. He's trying to show the extraordinary position of Christ, and that Judaism now is far inferior than what you have found in Christ. Yeah, it appears that you live in a living room, you worship in a living room, but what you have in Christ is far more.
You get done trying talking?
Okay. Does that mean I'm in trouble? What did you guys say? You didn't answer me. You didn't answer me.
I don't know. I just had a good discussion about heathenism with him, you know.
What's that?
So I just had a good talk about with heathens with him.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Okay, so he has made just a general statement here, but notice what he does throughout the rest of this chapter. Look with me at verse 4. So not only do you breathe through this man, this Son, he has received a much better name. He having become much better than the angels, as he has inherited a more excellent name than they. So the Son has a more excellent name than angels. Okay, I gotta stop there for a second, because for a Jew, are angels important? The last class, we did a whole thing on angelology. And through that discussion, Jews view angels highly. Why? You remember?
They're messengers.
They're messengers from heaven to man. So they carry the very words of God to humanity. But this Son has inherited even more excellent name than the angels. Look at verse 5. For to which of the angels did he ever say, "You are my son, today I have begotten you"? Which one did he say that to? None. Yeah, none of the angels have been given this credit. So already you're going to notice that Paul, author of Hebrews, is quoting from the Old Testament. Where does he find this passage? Do you remember? No, I don't expect you to have to know it, but Psalms chapter 2. You have to go there. Psalms chapter 2. Or I can put it up here. I can put it there. Here we go. Okay. Psalm chapter 2 has to do with, let me just read the psalm. So why are the nations in an uproar, or the nations devising, and the people devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together. I say this, against the Lord, against his anointed, saying, let us tear their feathers apart and cast away their cords from us. So you have this scene in the psalm where the nations gather together, they see this appointed one, and they say, let's take down the Lord. Okay, so.
What are fetters?
Of course you would ask.
Sorry.
We get it.
Feathers?
Yeah, it's like feathers.
Seriously, why?
No, I don't think so. But I'm gonna go with you until I figure it out here.
What version of the Bible do you read?
NASB. It's a little bit more of a wooden translation, but I like its faithfulness. Fetter is a fetter. I did not pay hundreds of dollars for that definition.
Feather is what?
My BDAG or hello said a fetter is a fetter. A chain or some type of restraint. Okay.
Okay, so let us tear apart the restraint.
Yeah.
Is it a verb or a noun? Like, is fetter like, I'm putting you in feathers? Or is it like, I'm fettering you?
Yeah, let's take away the bondage that and cast away their cords from us, the authority that reigns over us. Okay, so it's defaming the authority that God has over them. Right? And we actually, when we get into eschatology, we know this is actually a thing. The nations will actually see Jesus in his glory, and the nations will gather and say, we could get him. We can beat him. Crazy. In the book of Revelation, not in eschatology yet, but Revelation, Jesus says, just a mere word in there. Done. Okay, so in Psalms chapter 2, you have this scene, the nations gathering together to take down this Dagon Lord. He who sits in the heavens, I love this verse. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. It's like, that's cute. You guys brought your sticks out to play with God. But God's response to them is this. He will speak to them in his anger and terrify them. Do not go forward for you guys. Go forward. Yeah. Then he will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury. But as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. I will surely tell the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten you. So this is what the author of Hebrews quotes. Right? Jews, you know that God is going to install a king. Angels are great, but what's greater? The one God has appointed, the one who has been appointed by God.
So that is yet to be said, right?
The king has been installed.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so it matters when we get into eschatology, people will differ, right? So,
Okay.
Is Jesus on a throne right now?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, he's at the right hand of the Father, right? So some people will see that as the fulfillment of the Davidic promise.
Mm-hmm.
I will say, no, that's a partial fulfillment. That's where Jesus has always been. He's waiting to reign on earth. Right, so there's a distinction between heaven and earth. And so, because this is earthly language, I have installed my king on Zion, right, which is what? Jerusalem, right? So,
New Jerusalem.
so Hebrews chapter 1, yeah, you want the temple? Wait for the king who's going to reign at the temple, right? This is this like, you guys, Judaism is now so inferior. You have the one who will reign there, and you're worshiping him. So, yeah, sit in your living rooms for a little while, but when he comes, you'll be glad you did, right? He keeps trying to build in a more extraordinary view of Christ. Okay, so let's go back to Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 5. Now, I'm not going to be able to do this with all of them, but here in this section, he just layers on Old Testament language. Hebrews chapter 1, and again, so, which of the angels have I ever said, you are my son, and they have begotten you? And again, verse 6, I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me. Well, no, he's never said that to an angel. And when he again, verse 6, let me jump down to verse 6, and when he again brings the firstborn into the world, he says, and let all the angels of God worship him. Okay, so let's stop for a second, because there's a couple terms here. We got begotten and firstborn. Was Christ begotten and born? What do those terms mean?
Begotten, firstborn.
Yeah. Was there a day in which Jesus was not born?
No.
So he's eternal. Right? So what does firstborn mean?
So
Yeah, think like a Jew now. What does firstborn mean? Does it mean to be born first?
The one who is anointed.
Okay, you're getting close.
Like a king, like a royalty. I think.
Yeah, so firstborn means to have the inheritance, to be the most favored in a family. So Jacob was not born first, Esau was, but who got the blessing? Jacob, right? So it's the father's gifting of inheritance of the firstborn to the one to the son whom he desires.
So like Joseph.
It's the inheritance of whom he gives it to.
Joseph, out of all those family members.
Joseph is another great example. Was he the firstborn? No. But did his father delight in him above all the others? And why did the other brothers hate him? Because he had the firstborn right? Because his father favored him, right? So of all creation, of all things, who has been most honored by God? The Son, right? This guy, the image, his son. So yeah, so God's spoken burning bushes, through rainbows, through prophets. His last days he's spoken his most favorite, begotten, eternal Son. And by the way, he keeps your existence. Okay, so
God, it wasn't me.
so I only mentioned firstborn here because the Mormon, the Jehovah's Witness, like, oh, look, see, Jesus was born. No, right? Stop thinking like a postmodernist or Western. That means the one of most honor, right? And has God ever said to the angels, he has said, worship this one, this son. Okay, let's keep going. Verse 7. And by the way, not only is he worshipped by the angels, and the angels, he says, who makes his angels winds and his ministers a flame of fire? He quotes the Old Testament again to say that, by the way, the angels actually not only worship him, but they serve him. Which is an important moment. When Matthew records of the temptation of Christ, at the end of the temptation, what happens? When he says, Satan, go. I'm done with you. Or not. He's taken away, and who ministers to him?
An angel.
Angels. They feed him. Right? Yeah. So, Jews, you really appreciate angels. The angels serve him, and they worship him. Right? Verse 8. No, sorry, verse 8. But of the Son, he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. And the righteous scepter is the scepter of the king of his kingdom. Verse 9. You have loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness above your companions. So here, I'll just have to paraphrase this. He quotes Psalms 45. So you can clearly see that whoever's writing this is brilliant with the Old Testament. He's very familiar with the Old Testament. And here, by the way, he is the eternal image of the Son. And by the way, he's God. That's essentially what he's saying. So Jesus is worshipped by the angels. He's God, and he has been that forever. Look at verse 10. Verse 10. And the Lord is in the beginning laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of his hands. They will perish, but you remain, and they will all become like old garment. Verse 12. And like a mantle you roll them up, like a garment they will also be changed, but you are the same, and your years will not come to an end. So, yeah, so the temple, you want to go worship there, you want to be rooted back into Judaism, but you worship the one, this is crazy. So when I went to my family, we love Wallowa Lake. Have you ever been to Wallowa Lake? We love taking our vacations there. Well, there was one year where there was this young family, I think they were camping there for the first time. And it just rained for the first 3 days. And then they had this really, really nice tent. I remember walking by and going, that's a really, really nice tent. And it rained, it was cold. And eventually, after 2 days of this, they were gone. They were just totally gone. And it's like, oh, bummer. Well, it kind of weathered it out. And so then I went to throw my trash in this big garbage bin. And you know what was in the garbage bin? The tent! And I think they were just so done with it that they were like, just threw everything in it. Or I think also, you know how hard it is to get a tent back in its original bag? And it's such a bad experience. They're like, I don't even put the time to try to get it back in the bag. So I took it. I took it out of the thing, and I still have it at my house today. And I got it back in the bag. I grew up in the generation where the sleeping bag, like to get it back in its little pouch, like was super, super difficult. Now, I'm going to mention that because I have a hard time with the tent, and I have a hard time with the sleeping bag. God does, he rolls up the universe like it's nothing. Okay? So,
Have you ever tried a stuff sack? I can get you one, man. Literally.
what?
I said I can get you a stuff sack.
Okay, thank you, appreciate it. But God takes by his hands a universe and rolls it up. The one whom you worship, he can take the entire universe and stuff it back in its bag.
That's terrifying.
Why do you want to go worship at the temple? You worship the one that gives you life, breath. The angels worship him. He created everything. He sustains everything. And if it ends, you still have him, right? So why do you want to go back? He concludes with this. But to which of the angels has he ever said, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet? Verse 14. And they are not all ministering spirits set out to render service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation. So, in chapter 1 of Hebrews, you recognize what he's trying to do is he's trying to produce an extraordinary view of Christ so that those who are tempted of leaving Christ stay. Right? And I think we all do that. I think we all have moments of life where we wonder, is Jesus really worth pursuing? And what anchors us in those moments to stay? Author of Hebrews provides us just a wonderful, refreshing reality that we have everything that we need in Christ. And if we were to leave Christ, we go back to something that's inferior. And we'll find ourselves even lacking wanting more. And so, for the readers, he just presses the extraordinary view of Christ just higher and higher. The reason why we read the Gospels is not just because we are young in our faith and we want to know how Jesus lived his life, so we want to become familiar with him. And then we read it once and then we're done. The reason why we read the Gospels over and over and over again is so that the view of Christ keeps being pressed up in our minds in extraordinary ways. We reread the moment when Jesus says, be called. Because in that moment, when you read it, you realize, holy cow, this one has creation obeying him. And in that moment, you go, that's my Lord. why would I want to go towards temples, buildings, vessels when I have that? And it grounds the believer to cherish their people. And so that's what the author of Hebrews does throughout the entire letter. He tries to strengthen the reader by strengthening the view of Christ. So here's my rough outline. We're going to jump over to James. But in the midst of this, he gives us 5 warnings. If you leave, he has to remind the reader, you have to be attentive to this. You have to fix your mind towards this. So I said this in already, Hebrews chapter 2. For this reason, we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, so that we will not drift away from it. So there is a danger to hear Christ, to respond to Christ, to enjoy Christ, and walk away. Heard me mention this before. Matthew 13.
So someone could know God and then reject him? Like if you really have accepted the Lord or repented and you're changed, does that mean you wouldn't?
Okay. Oh, those are 2 questions.
Okay.
So let me read this one. So this is the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes, snatches away what has been sown in his heart. So we can preach the gospel. Some be like, I don't get it. That's Satan snatching it away from them, clouding their mind from being able to understand the grace of God. Yeah, and we just assume it's intellectual problem, right? No, but there's a spiritual reality at play within society today. Verse 20. The one on whom seed was sown on the rocky places, this is the man who hears the word and immediately receives it. He receives it with joy. He receives it. He takes hold of it. And yet has no firm root in himself, but is only temporary. So there's a type of receiving that's really not receiving. It's to put in one's mind and stir it temporarily. But when affliction or persecution arise because of the word, immediately he falls away. So there is this danger for someone to be brought into understanding who God is. They receive it, they're contemplating it, but then as a result of trouble or persecution, they get rid of it. Right? And quite frankly, today we're seeing a lot of people that I assumed were girded in Christ because of the troubles that Christians are bearing today. They're wanting to reject Christianity. And there is a type of receiving that is not receiving. Well, one more. 1 Corinthians, we did this just a couple weeks ago. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Now I know to you, brethren, the gospel which I preached to you, which you also received. Right? So how do we receive the gospel? Okay. When I preached to you, which you also received, in which you now also stand, by which you also are saved, if you hold fast the word which I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. So how do you know if you're saved? You hold it. Right? How do you know if you are sanctified, you're held in Christ, you believe it? How does Jacob know he's saved tomorrow? I still believe it. Now, who helps me believe? God, through His Spirit. I trust that the Spirit within me will enable me to believe tomorrow, right? But there's still this intellectual response to that invitation, right? So, author of Hebrews is saying, hold fast, hold fast to that which is preached to you. Don't go back to Judaism. For that receiving that you once had was all in vain. It wasn't reception at all. We won't go through 1 John. Can you do one more? 1 John. Okay, 1 John chapter 2, verse 15. Do not love the world or the things of the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. So you can't love the world. You have to love Christ. And by loving Christ, you love the Father. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the boastful pride of life, it is not from the Father, but it is from the world. The world is passing away and also its lusts, but why would you hope in it? Right? It's like the temple. Like, why would you want the temple? It's going to be destroyed. You have Christ. Even if the universe gets wiped off, you still have Christ. That's pretty cool. The world, it wants its lusts, well, that's going to be gone. Why would you love it not? But the one who does the will of God lives forever. So here, children, it's the last hour. Just as you heard that there are antichrist, that the Antichrist is coming, even now many antichrists have appeared. For this we know that it is the last hour. They went out from us, but were not really of us. For if they had been of us, they would have remained with us. But they went out, so that it would be shown that they all are not of us. So there are those who will grow up in the church, and they will abandon. Okay. And as a result of the abandon, they were never of us.
Considered antichrists.
It's sad. And we're seeing tons of it. Tons of it in this generation. People, and the Pilgrims saw this. They thought, we can escape Europe and we can create a Christian empire, right? This is the whole empire. And so then our children will want to follow Christ. There won't be any of this worldly desire. And all of a sudden, the Pilgrims recognize, uh-oh, our kids are becoming adults making decisions for themselves, and they have nothing to do with that. Some of them, many of them. And so every generation has to make a decision to follow Christ. And the surrounding culture is going to be begging for them. Just like Judaism, come back, come back. And a good factor to determining whether the Spirit of God is within you is where you stand. Where you stand. And so I don't know if that's helpful. And that's kind of what author of Hebrews will continue to do. Don't be like Israel that wants to go back to Egypt. Because you will be Israel by leaving Jesus for Judaism. And he wants to please with them. Don't do it. It lose power. Okay? So that is Hebrews. We'll transition next week